Thank you, Maria Regina, Monica for the invitation, Letitia. They know I'm going to say that, so that they can translate. I speak fast.
Skip that part.
But no, I'm particularly pleased to be here because it's an opportunity for me to return to this city after a very long time. And I first came here 22 years ago when I was probably the only person who should be sitting in this room because I was doing a study of both India and Brazil. At the time, of course, this was considered back in India to be quite ridiculous. Why would anyone want to study Brazil? But I'm glad to see that in those peculiar ways that the world turns, there's now a room full of people who seem to think that it's a perfectly sensible thing to do, and I'm very glad to be joining you. Having sort of invoked the past, let me do it again in a slightly different kind of way, because I come here from a conference which was convened to address the 50th anniversary of the non-aligned movement. So in 1961 in Belgrade was the first meeting of the non-aligned movement. And here we are 50 years later. And it seemed like an appropriate time to discuss whether it was in fact Yugoslavia or India or somebody else which convened this whole process. I mentioned that not just to share with you my sense of time travel, jumping from 50 years ago to this sort of postmodern moment, but because I think that we've already heard in earlier panels the invocation of the Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement as being conceptual, if not genealogical, originators of the kind of discussion that we're having today. So could a South-South discussion be possible if we didn't have the history of Bandung, if we didn't have the history of the non-aligned movement to turn to as a kind of, if you will, intellectual legitimator of this kind of forum? Now, this to me is a very important point of origin or departure, because I've noticed that the frequency with which Bandung and the non-aligned movement, the origins of the non-aligned movement, are invoked is usually directly related to the lack of information people have about Bandung and the non-aligned conference. So in my remarks, I want to make two broad points. One is to turn to history, to look at that moment, 1955, 1961, to talk about what allowed Bandung to take place, what allowed the non-aligned movement to take place, and throw out some arguments about the relationship of the two, some of which I hope you will find unusual. And in the remainder of my time, I want to pick up on one of the keywords, obviously, of this panel, namely security, and ask whether, as we adapt and modify and change our notion of security, what does it mean for what we might be able to imagine as South-South cooperation? So these are the two things I want to do in the next 20 minutes, if I can get my computer to turn on. Yeah. Okay, collaboration. I'm going to jump straight into a series of assertions about Bandung and the non-aligned movement, and I'm happy to fill in the details in the discussion, but in the interest of time. The first thing I want to suggest is that Bandung should not be seen as a precursor to the non-aligned movement, but rather an end to what I'm calling the period of racialism in international affairs. Bandung was the moment when the African Asian countries, 29 of them, come together in Indonesia in order, it appears, to articulate that a new world was possible and that formerly colonized countries could get together on a common agenda and a common platform to make a move towards probably changing the nature of existing world order. That's the conventional view. And what I want to suggest is that Bandung was the moment when it became clear, especially to the countries that led the conference, the so-called Colombo powers and China, it became clear to them that a common colonial history and geographical proximity did not, in fact, permit intellectual or policy or political agreement of a high order. Of course, they agreed on some things. But really what I'm trying to say is that Bandung was an end of a certain kind of moment, an anti-colonial moment, in that, not that colonialism as a condition did not continue, but in that a certain way of seeing the world, in primarily civilizational and racial terms, comes to an end. In that sense, you can see the difference between Bandung and the non-aligned movement with the arrival of Yugoslavia in particular as one of the key organizing countries that leads to non-alignment, because what is most common among Egypt, India, and Yugoslavia in the founding of the non-aligned movement is that they have very little in common, and that they're very far from each other, and that they have no issues in contention. Now, Bandung might have failed for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the United States, making sure that its allies did their best to destroy the conference. Nonetheless, by the time it comes to the end of the conference, and Sri Lanka proposes, then it's called Ceylon, proposes to India that they have another conference soon, the Prime Minister of India says, we barely got out of Bandung with our skin intact. We're not going towards another conference for a long period of time. That's exactly the time when Tito, when Nasser and Nehru start getting together to plan the next movement, which is non-alignment, which is the non-aligned conference. Yugoslavia wanted non-alignment because they were trying to break free of the Soviet Union. India wanted non-alignment because China couldn't be present, since it was clearly aligned. And Egypt wanted non-alignment because it was coming out of the Suez crisis and needed international support for a variety of different, for the obvious sorts of reasons. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that the notions of history, commonality, and common historical experience proved inadequate to produce one form of international social gathering. An entirely different set of conditions, countries with entirely different sets of reasons, come together to produce something called the non-aligned movement, which has, of course, continued up to this day in a variety of forms, and is not an insubstantial, it's the largest gathering of states within the UN umbrella. However, I think it's critical to remember that it's a minimalist coalition. It's not a coalition that comes together with agreement on a variety of issues. And I think that if you look over the long span of non-alignment, of the non-aligned movement, what we find is that disarmament and anti-colonialism, particularly in relation to South Africa and other formerly colonized countries, were the two issues that always provided a base of unity. By saying that, we're talking about hundreds of other issues on which countries could not find agreement. Finally, I want to suggest that for all the, shall we say, appropriateness of calls like a new international economic order, the more radical, if you will, edge of non-alignment and other forms of international gatherings, it was precisely when the movement became more radical that it began to break down. What does this suggest? At the very least, I think, when we think about India, Brazil, and South Africa, let's actually say explicitly that one of the best things it has to its advantage is that these countries do not know each other well, that they're far from each other, and that they don't have a variety of existing conditions which were going to upset their bilateral relations. The moment we bring China into this story, however, a different story ensues. So in that sense, I think I would agree with some of the discussion that took place in the earlier panel about the difference between IBSA and BRICS. Okay, enough about the history. I think I've made the point quite clearly that we need to be, I think, aware of the limitations of international gatherings for a whole variety of reasons. And let's not assume that, in a sense, in a form of crude academic projection, that because our own interests lie in a certain direction, or because we all happen to have a certain set of ideological beliefs, that those, in fact, may be represented by the countries that we come from. The second large point I want to make, or the second point I want to make, is this question of security. Now, obviously what I'm trying to think about is forms of changing sources of insecurity rather than security with a big S, And in particular, I want to think about, rather than identifying the notion of security right away, I want to begin with the distinction that Niklas Luhmann makes between risk and danger. Now, a number of you may be familiar with this argument. I'm not going to go into any depth. Again, I just can sort of flag it for you. But let me say that the difference between risk and danger is that danger comes from sources that we have no control over, external sources. So the danger that is produced by the volcano in Chile, which creates environmental catastrophe, is a danger problem, whereas risk is the problem that's produced when the Fukushima reactor goes up in Japan and 100,000 people in that neighborhood are forced to be evacuated. So the degree of man-made intervention is the way that Luhmann originally distinguishes between risk and danger, and it's that distinction that I want to work with a little bit in what I have to say about security. Now here, just a side comment. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty will find a very interesting essay that he wrote some time ago where he in fact breaks this distinction down, arguing that even something like climate change, because of its cause, in a sense, in a larger sense, by human hands, means the merging of geological time and human time in a way that we've never seen before. Okay, just put that on the table. It's fun to talk about, but I really want to talk about other stuff. Okay, so risk then comes from a variety of human interactions with institutions, technology, nature, both flora as well as fauna. And I'm going to generalize our discussion of the dangers of risk to jumble these together. I'm going to generalize them under the larger sign of biosecurity. Now, underlying the shift to address insecurities defined in terms of risk, or as I'm calling it, biosecurity, Lakoff and Collier in particular, who've done a lot of work on this question, have argued that this represents a shift from prevention, of which deterrence is probably the most overdeveloped form, to preparedness. And when we talk about preparedness as a theme, as a construct of governmental behavior, as a governmental practice, we realize that the Department of Defense, or the ministries of defense around the world, may be the least equipped to deal with this particular problem. So what are the kinds of crises that I want to alert you to in relation to this question of risk? I'm going to draw all my examples from Asia, but I'm sure you can supplement them with cases drawn from Latin America. The Southeast Asian haze, which emerged a number of years ago, coming out of the burning forests of Sumatra, where local communities were essentially clearing ground, as they did every year. It became an ecological crisis that covered and blocked air traffic and other forms, created other health hazards for an entire zone of Southeast Asia. The avian bird flu crisis, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and the SARS pandemic. Now, each of these are different, and I'm not trying to say that they're all the same. Their sources are different, their nature is different, but each of these are the kinds of crises for whom prevention, in a sense, isn't really possible. Preparedness becomes the primary mode by which states address the nature of these kinds of pandemics and crises. And these biosecurity threats are probably issues that are going to be very much on the agenda in the future, both because of the intensification of interaction between man and nature, man and animal, and different forms of human societies, but also because these are inherently global problems. And I think you can see why they cross borders without any difficulty. So what comes into play here is what Michael Mann has called the infrastructural power of the state, or what Michel Foucault in a slightly different context calls biopolitics. Right? So we're talking about biopolitics, infrastructural power, in relation to a larger question of biosecurity as these new forms of, they're not actually new, but they're identified new forms of global threat. Biopolitical practices, and this is a very Foucauldian definition, are distinct from sovereign and disciplinary practices of the state, because they consider the population as a unit rather than the individual. Okay? So the individual is no longer the site of subjectification by the state, rather it's the population as a whole, and its well-being is in fact the practice that biopolitics is seeking to ensure. The most mundane forms of biopolitical practice that we encounter in our everyday lives are public distribution and public health. Namely, the effort by the state, whether welfare state or not, to reach those most marginal members of society and provide them with a basket of goods that they can use in order to survive, and public health efforts, inoculations of population, and other forms of practice that allow for a population to be well and therefore not infect everybody else. So these are security measures in the sense that now the most marginal and the most extended areas of the population have now come under the purview of the protection of the state, not because this is an altruistic or a welfarist state, but because illness or sickness or ill health or weakness in these marginal populations cannot remain contained there, but will in fact inhabit and will come to contaminate the center itself. So it's very important not to see this as simply welfarist in idea. It's very much driven by the notion of security, but we're not talking about guns and bombs, about tanks and missiles. In other words, the particular forms of state behavior and practice in institutions that come into play when we're thinking about biosecurity are those that are easiest mapped, as I've already said, in the form of public distribution or in the form of public health, but they depend upon the infrastructural power of the state to map the entire national body. In other words, the most explicit form of biopolitics might be the census and other statistical devices. It cannot be said enough how difficult it is to build this infrastructural power of the state to achieve these ends, and how few states are able to do this with any degree of success, as the objective is something that's actually not fixed, no matter how much we think it is, namely a universal map of the territorial national body. Under this set of conditions, when I'm talking about biosecurity, when I'm thinking about these sorts of conditions, what does collaboration, or I think the word is cooperation, look like? And I think this is really the challenge that we have to consider moving forward. Can we, and I want to put out 3 different kinds of technologies, I'm calling them, but you'll have to bear with me because it's a very expanded notion of technology, where in a sense we might be able to imagine forms of cooperation which draw on the particular kinds of expertise that are only available in an India, in a Brazil, and in a South Africa. I've obviously chosen examples that I think work. I'm not an expert on Brazil or South Africa, so I look forward to your corrections, but these are the 3 I want to put out on the table. One technology I'm calling practical expertise. India is probably the country that's best in the world in conducting elections and conducting censuses. We've got more people than anybody else. We keep having elections. We've gotten quite good at it. Okay? It's a form of technological expertise. It's a form of practice. It's a form of mapping that, in a sense, extends towards the entire population. It's actually packageable and can be shared. The second technology I'm calling conceptual legal innovations. And here I'm thinking particularly of South Africa and the radical constitution, radical in my mind, but I think extraordinary constitution that they wrote when they became independent, which I will call the redefinition of the meanings and entitlements of citizenship. A form of citizenship that entitles you to a certain amount of water every day seems to strike me as being a radical innovation in what citizenship means. Now, it may not be possible for the South African state to deliver this particular entitlement, but it's not a promise. It's not a welfarist attribution. It's actually something that says that in order to be a fully functional human being, a certain set of resources are necessary, of which water is the most critical. So here I'm talking about an innovative structure, a way of thinking about the world, which I think draws very explicitly from a certain history, but again is modular, which can be packaged and sent everywhere else. And finally, I want to move away just from practical experience and legal innovations and talk about a form of social practice. And this to me is critical because there has been a tendency, and I think whenever you get so many political scientists in a room, this happens, that we tend to talk about the state as a thing out there. And I want to introduce perhaps a more relational and iterative notion of state-society relations by invoking the success of the public health system in the city of Belo Horizonte, thanks to the efforts of, as I understand it, the health workers' social movement, which has created in that city a form of social practice delivering health, which is more successful, as far as I know, than any other city in Brazil. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. There are sure to be people here who know much more about it than I do, but this is the kind of practice that I'm trying to identify as being the mode through which cooperation in this new security agenda can be imagined. Finally, I want to close by saying, especially when the scale, now these, the scale of the kinds of interventions or practices that I want to point to as being emblematic of the form of cooperation I'd like to see in the future, when the scale is not national in scope, and when the state is not the only player, but where civil society is a critical actor in some form, whatever civil society means, how do we find the mechanisms to share and learn from each other? It seems to me that this is the critical question that needs to be put on the table if we are to talk about South-South cooperation in the 21st century moving forward. It's not easy, or it's not correct even, I believe, to turn to the past, although we can learn from it, from its various mistakes. But I think we also need to talk about cooperation not in general, but in relation to a particular set of problems and issues that are facing us, and that through the efforts of state and civil society in our own national histories, we have come up with radical and innovative solutions. Those, I think, are the starting points which need to be brought to bear in relation to this larger question of cooperation. So let me stop here and thank you for listening.